Daf, we'll get started. The three of us on Daf Memchet. A little bit fun, but we got up there consistently. So this mission is the last mission in this parak, and actually it's going to be quite a review for everyone, which is a good thing. It's good to review this sometimes. But says the Mishnah, Ezehu Mamzer, right? We've been discussing, and we're going to continue in Yevamot to discuss the Arayot, right? This is really where we discuss all the details of who is prohibited and how we know that. So far, we've been talking, of course, a lot about as everyone remembered in the first parak, the Shniot, which we actually mentioned in the second parak too, right? The Arayot Drabanan, which got very confusing, unfortunately, right? Do you all recall? But the big question of our Mishnah is what's a mamzer, right? The Torah says in Kiteitzei, Lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem, gam dor asiri lo yavo hina, right? So mamzer cannot come even 10 generations, but it doesn't define what is a mamzer. So the psukim before, it's very interesting, right? Because obviously I don't have a chumash in front of me, but we have we have the lists of the arayot, as you recall. We're going to have this week's parsha, right? Achimot, and I think today's Achimot, right? And Kedoshim, the next couple of weeks. And that's where you have lists of, don't sleep with this person, that person, right? So we can discuss some of the rationale for those lists. In Dvarim, there's like an eclectic list in Kiteitzei. It says, there's a whole story of Na'ara Marasa, which is, its own story. And then it says, Lo tikach ishet aviv. Don't sleep with the father's wife, which seems redundant because we already know that halacha. But lo yigale knaf aviv. Don't reveal the coat, maybe the skirt of your father, person's father, which we have had debates, and we're going to continue today to understand who is included. Like, what are we adding? We said don't sleep with the father's wife. Remember, there's a prohibition already of sleeping with the mother, which is unrelated, right? So father's wife, in this case, is assuming it's not the person's mother. And then what is the knaf aviv? So I'll speak this out, but this is basically the whole Gemara today. There was one shot that we quoted already that was referring to Anusat Aviv. Anusat Aviv literally means the person's father raped, but as we discussed earlier, it means anyone the father had sexual relations with outside of marriage, right? So it could have been forced, but it could have been consensual. It just wasn't through marriage. So in that case, a person, according to that Manda Amar, the Torah is telling me you can't sleep with the person the person's father slept with, right? So that's a prohibition, even if the father was never married to that person. That's Knaf Aviv. Another explanation, which we've quoted earlier, is that in fact it's referring to Shomeret Yavim of the father, meaning if a brother dies and the father is supposed to do Yibum but doesn't, for whatever reason, someone does Chalitza, he dies, but then the son of that father, so the nephew basically of the first brother who died, cannot sleep with that woman, not just because cannot sleep with that woman. So that also seems to be a little redundant because that is Eshet Achi Aviv, right? That's a father's brother's wife, which the Torah says is prohibited. So why you would need a separate Isser for that is also unclear. But basically the Torah is adding something with this. And then there's one verse in between, which is a little bit of a problem. And then it says, Lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem, right? So we understand that this pasuk is meant to teach you who's a mamzer, right? So mamzer is someone who's similar to the prohibition of that pasuk. So says the Mishnah now, Ezehu mamzer, kol she'er basar shehu below yavo. Any relationship, she'er basar means relationship of flesh, meaning you share genes with, right? That is, that's how I'm translating it, but anyways, it's something to do with the connection that has a lo taseh of don't sleep with them, don't lo yavo. Divrei Rabbi Akiva, and this is Rabbi Akiva's famous opinion that a lo taseh, wherever the Torah says don't sleep with the person, it's the child of that illicit relationship is a mamzer. Of course, our Mishnah is adding a detail which was not obvious earlier and is not completely agreed upon, which is that it's not every lo taseh. It's every lo taseh that's she'er basar, that has to do with relationship. So a lo taseh, it doesn't have to do with relationship. For example, Rashi's famous example is machzir gushato, right? A person divorces a woman, and then she marries someone else. He's not allowed to remarry her. It says lo yachol lekachta, right? Lo yachshuv lekachta. But if he does, that's a lo taseh. But that's not she'er basar because the person's wife is not their relationship, right? They're not she'er. I mean, they are related, but they're not genetically related, right? And so, according to our Mishnah, that would not be a mamzer, even according to Rabbi Akiva. Continues the Mishnah, Divrei Rabbi Akiva, Shimon HaTeimani Omer, and this is the famous opinion of Shimon HaTeimani, Kol Shechayavin Alav Karet Bidei Shamayim, anyone who has a prohibition of karet associated with that illicit relationship, then then the child, the offspring, will be a mamzer. The halacha kidvarav, and the Mishnah adds these words because this is obviously very critical. Halacha is like Rabbi Shimon or like Shimon HaTeimani, not Rabbi Shimon, Shimon HaTeimani. Rabbi Yoshua goes further and he says it's not just an Isser Karet. It's Kol Shechayavin Alav Mita B'dei Shamayim. It has to be a Mita B'dei Shamayim. An Isser Karet alone is not enough to make a mamzer. Now, Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. Matzati, said Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. Now, yeah, there's a little bit of debate about the Rabbi Shimon, but says Rabbi Shimon ben Azai. Matzati Megillat Yuchasim B'Yerushalayim. I found, remember, they didn't used to write down a lot of things. They didn't write down the Mishnah or the Gemara, of course, back in those days. But I found a scroll that was basically a scroll that details the genealogy, right? Detailed where people came from, which was a challenging issue and very important to them back then. I think it's very important today too. And Katuv Bad said in it, Ish Ploni, so-and-so is a mamzer me'eshet ish, because he is the offspring of a married woman who had an affair with another person and had a child. And that turned them basically into a mamzer, implying the kind of Divrei Rabbi Yoshua, that it goes like Rabbi Yoshua, which again is not how we paskin, but this Megillah made it sound like Rabbi Yoshua that only a Isser Mita, which like an Eshet Ish, would be a mamzer. Now, continues the Mishnah, and we're going to see later today, we're not going to see, but we're going to ask why in the world this is here. But this is a good review for us. Ishto shemita, if a person's wife dies, mutar ba'achota, you're allowed to marry the wife's sister, right? Unlike pretty much every other arayot, not everyone, but almost every other one, which it happens, a person can't sleep with their father's wife, even if their father dies. It doesn't change the prohibition of the father's wife or a brother's wife or things like that. But a person who can't, right, one of the arayot is isha va'achota, a woman and her sister, but that's only true when the woman's alive. If she dies, mutar ba'achota. And if you're garsha, if you divorce that woman, it doesn't matter. You still can't sleep with her sister. It's only if meita, if then the woman who you've divorced dies, who was your ex-wife, then mutar ba'achota. Then you can marry or sleep with the sister. Niseit la'acher, if she marries another man, another person, doesn't matter either. Only if meita, mutar ba'achota. So in all these cases, the what happens with this woman after she's married doesn't matter. It's only if she's alive or not alive. The same thing is true about Yevamot. Yevamto shemita, right? Remember, the Torah says that a Yevamto, a person who does chalitza, right? You didn't marry Yevamah, let's say. Well, actually, it's not necessarily the case. It could also be if he did marry her, but then she died. Mutar ba'achota, right? So that is the case. Sorry, Yevamto is if he married her and then she died, he can then marry her sister, which seems again redundant. Chalatzla umeta, if he does chalitza, it's essentially like he divorced her during her lifetime. He can't sleep with her sister, marry her sister, but once she dies, he can. Umeta mutar ba'achota, and even if she's niseit la'acher, she marries another person, umeta, and then she dies, mutar ba'achota. So this seems pretty redundant, but these are things that we all know by now about the Isser of Achot Isha, right? So get back to mamzer. Says the Gemara, my time with Rabbi Akiva. Now, what's the source for Rabbi Akiva that a person is only a child is a mamzer if the parents are in an illicit relationship that has an Isser Lotase, that has she'er basar, that has relation, that has.
You were frozen. We didn't hear what you said.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I'm hearing. Yeah.
I don't know where I got frozen. Let's start from the Gemara again. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. Is Rabbi Akiva a broader category or a more restrictive category?
It's a broader. So this, the prevailing opinion of Shimon HaTeimani, which is how we paskin, is that it's an Isser Karet. Rabbi Akiva adds to that. It says even relationships that are not an Isser Karet but are an Isser Lotase, right, are the child, the offspring will be a mamzer. But our Mishnah added a stipulation that it's only a she'er basar, right? Only a lotase that has to do with relationships, with physical relationship. Is that the right word? Yeah, or genetic relationship maybe. So not other lotases. Please let me know if I get cut off. I don't know why the connection's not good. But what's the reason? My time with Rabbi Akiva, dichtiv, because the pasuk says, and this is a pasuk again in Ki Tetzei that I was quoting earlier, Lo yikach ish et eshet aviv, which again is repetitive because we know, of course, that halacha already, that a person cannot take his father's wife. Again, it's assuming it's not his mother. So it's his mother, there's separate prohibitions. And it continues the pasuk, but lo yigale knaf aviv, don't reveal your father's skirt. That's how I'm translating it. What does that mean? Knaf shara'a aviv lo yigale. You should not reveal what your father revealed, essentially. Meaning, if your father slept with a woman, you should not sleep with her as well. Now, as I said, Savra Lak Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Akiva agrees with the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda, the Amar that Ba'anusat Aviv HaKatuv Medaber, that the Torah, when it says, what's this extra woman who's related to a person's father, it's referring to a woman whose father had relations with outside of marriage. Again, the terminology is Anusat Aviv, which would mean forced, raped, but it could be true about any, we used Anusa in any context that's not marriage, right? So could be consensual as well. That detail does not matter for this prohibition. So that is a chayve lavin. That's only a chayiv lav. There's no iser karet or iser nida for a sleeping with a woman who a father's had a relationship with, who wasn't outside of marriage. And samachlei, then 2 psukim later it says lo yavo mamzer b'kal Hashem. So, which again doesn't define what that is, but what we're learning from these psukim is that alma mehani havi mamzer. From this relationship, the product, the child, would be a mamzer. Okay, so that is how Rabbi Akiva learns it. It says an extra pasuk v'yikach eshet aviv and knaf aviv, and then it says mamzer shortly afterwards. Says the Gemara, that's a good proof if you hold that's which our Mishnah clearly holds, that's Rabbi Akiva's opinion. But if you recall, we discussed earlier, and we'll repeat it here, that there are other opinions of Rabbi Akiva, right? There were 2 other opinions of Rabbi Akiva. One was that it wasn't just a lo taseh that had share, that had relationship. It was any lo taseh, right? Even a lo taseh with no relationship. For the example I gave before, machzir grushato, right? Where a person is not allowed to sleep with a woman who he was once married to, who then he divorced and remarried somebody else. Right? But that's not a kurva, that's not a physical relationship, it's a marriage, right? But it's not a genetic relationship. And according to some opinions, Rabbi Akiva would say that child is a mamzer. And then, of course, there's also Isser Aseh, right? So the Torah, for example, says, Amoni Umoavi, no, that's a lotasi. It says by Adomi, right? Adomi, Dar Revi'i, can marry into Bnei Yisrael. If a convert from Edom comes in, they can marry into Bnei Yisrael in the 4th generation, which means that before the 4th generation, they cannot marry into Yisrael, right? So and that's what we call lo taseh aba mechla aseh. The Torah says marry them in the 4th generation, meaning you can't marry them in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd generations. And so that is an even lower prohibition, though it's clearly a prohibition. It's basically an isur aseh. So the implication would be that is not a mamzer, right? Says the Gemara, what about those Amoraim, right? Rabbi Simai, who's marbeh, according to Rabbi Akiva, sha'ar chayvei lavin delav d'she'er, other Isurei lavin that are not related to genetics, right? Share, and Rabbi Yeshevav, who's marbeh afilu chayvei aseh. Rabbi Yeshevav, who says that Rabbi Akiva holds that a child is a mamzer even from an Isra aseh, even from say Adomi or something that you're not allowed to do only from an aseh. They learn that nafkum milei mi vilo. Torah says vilo with the vav is extra. And so basically the Torah is saying a mamzer is a child who fits this category plus more, right? And the plus more depends on how you understand Rabbi Akiva. Either it adds lo taseh that does not have she'er, or it adds an isra aseh even. So that word vilo is how they learn that. Now, Shimon HaTimani savar la kirabanan. Shimon HaTimani agrees with Rabbi Akiva that this is the source of how you define a mamzer. But he disagrees with what the case is in the pasuk. Rabbi Akiva understood that the case was anusat aviv, which is a lo taseh, someone whose father had relations with outside of marriage. That's only a lo taseh. But Rabbi Shimon HaTimani says that the pasuk is not referring to that. When it says lo yigale knaf aviv, that's like the Rabbanan, the Amri shomeret yavim shel aviv hakatuv medaber. Torah is actually referring to knaf aviv is a person's father's, almost relation, basically. That's how we'd say knaf, meaning a shomeret yavim. A person's uncle died, the wife, the widow, fell to his father, right? The father did not end up marrying her, father died or whatever, it doesn't matter, right? But the woman is a korva, is related to the father because she was omeid for yibum. So the Torah is telling me don't sleep with her. Now, of course, we already know that because she is Eshet Achi Aviv. She's the wife of the father's brother. But it's telling you an extra time to tell you this is how you define a mamzer, right? And that's an Isser Karet. The Havi Lechayvei Kritut. B'samach lei lo yavo mamzer. Alma michayvei kritut havi mamzer. So it says Shimon HaTeimani. This verse is that's how I know that a person is a mamzer only michayvei kritut and above. And Rabbi Yoshua, who says the Chiyav Beitin, he says, what the Torah could have said, Lichtav Rachmana lo yigale knaf aviv. Why do you remember? The weird thing about this pasuk is that it says lo yikach ishet aviv and lo yigale knaf aviv. Why couldn't it just say the second part? If everything that you're learning is from yigale knaf aviv, just say that. Say lo yigale knaf aviv, and then the child's a mamzer. The fact that it says the beginning of the pasuk lo yikach ishet aviv, and then it says the second category is actually something very brilliant. It's telling you that there are different categories within Isur Biyah, right? There's a category of Lo Yikach, and there's a category of Lo Yigaleh, and only one of those is a mamzer, right? Lo Yikach lamali, alalav hachikamer. The Torah is telling you the following, 2 lines from the bottom. Me lo Yikach ad Lo Yigaleh, meaning from things that are in Lo Yikach et Eshet Aviv, which is an Isur Mitah, to Lo Yigale, which is an Isser Lo Taseh or an Isser Karet maybe, Havi Mamzer. But Tfei Lo Havi Mamzer, that basically the Torah is actually saying this whole extra thing to tell you only one group is a Mamzer, not everything else. And only Lo Yikach, meaning the Eshet Aviv, which is an Isser Mitah, but not everything else, which is lower Isurim of Karet or Lo Taseh or even Aseh. So that is the Machlok.
Wait, which one is the mamzer? Lo Yikach or Lo Yigaleh? Lo Yigaleh is it's not as bad as Lo Yikach.
Correct. Right.
Wouldn't you expect the second one to be worse than this first one, or not necessarily?
Well, I think Lo Yikach is very explicit. Eshet Aviv defines it's you can't read it any other way. It's the wife of the father. Lo Yigaleh is the one that's vague, right? It just says don't reveal Knaf Aviv. We don't know who that's referring to. So there's different, as we said today, right? There's either it's a Shomer Avim or it's a Anusat Aviv, but neither of those is as severe Isur as Lo Yigaleh, Lo Yikach Eshet Aviv. Now, says Abai a very, very important halacha, which we have not really, I don't think we've mentioned till now, which is that although our Mishnah makes it sound like being a mamzer has to do with how bad the prohibition of sleeping with that person is, it's not always true. Because there are cases, for most specifically a nida, where there's a prohibition, Isser Karet, in the Torah, not to sleep with the nida, but the child of a relationship with the nida is not a mamzer, right? So even though the prohibited act is very severe, it's not only the act that matters, it's also the relationship. And so the Torah only describes a mamzer in a case where a person cannot legally marry that person, presumably. Right? We had this whole discussion before. Is Kedushin Tovsin by Chayve Lavin, and Kedushin Tovsin by Chayve Karet, right? Which relates to this. But Rabbi Abaya is pointing out that Hakol Modim, at the bottom line, that Ba'al HaNida, that a person who inappropriately sleeps with a woman who's a Nida, or Al HaSota, right? Now remember, if a man warns his wife about not having yichud and sleeping, he's afraid she's sleeping with another man, he gives her a warning and he finds out that she did in fact do it. She committed adultery. So we learned earlier, we've discussed this before, that he's not allowed to stay married to her, right? He's got to divorce her. He can't sleep with her. And the Torah says, don't. Well, don't go back and sleep with her. If you do, then the child's not a mamzer, even though you're not allowed to do that. It's a lotase, but the child's not a mamzer. Why? She'ein avlan mamzer. Everyone agrees in both of those cases that the offspring are not considered mamzerim. Why is that? So nida da tafsi ba kiddushin. Because a nida, although it's totally prohibited to sleep with a woman who's a nida, if a man does, or if a man marries a woman who's a nida, if you're not sleeping with her, but if he marries her, kiddushin is tofsin. Unlike chayve lavin, right? If a man goes over and gives kiddushin to his mother, there's no kiddushin there, right? There's no kiddushin is not chal by a isser of, in that case, nida. But by a nida, we learned specifically that if a man goes to a nida who he couldn't sleep with and gives her kiddushin, kiddushin is chal. Shenamar, we learned that from a pasuk which says, "Vatihi nidata alav," that her nida will be on her, which means, says the Gemara, "Afila b'shat nidata tafsi ba kiddushin." And so therefore, remember, so this is adding a whole new aspect to mamzerut, which is it's not just that the relationship is prohibited, so the man can't sleep with this woman because of whatever relationship, it's that there will be no kiddushin if he did marry her. And so because of that, they're both unmarried, so to speak, and it's a prohibited relationship. But if you only have one of those things, now, it doesn't mean that a person has to marry a nida for the child not to be a mamzer. It means that because there's a potential for marriage, right, the child's not a mamzer. So if a person outside of marriage sleeps with a woman who's a nida, and there's no other prohibition there, right, neither of them's married or related, well, neither's married, she's not married, and they're not related, then there's no mamzerut in that relationship. So that's a nida. And sota nami, the same thing is true about a sota, the hataf siba kiddushin. And in fact, the kiddushin, this is how Rashi understands it, that the kiddushin is still there, meaning that a man whose wife slept with someone else who committed adultery, he is still married to her, right? She's not, even though he's not allowed to stay married to her, it didn't automatically abrogate the kiddushin. He still has to give her a get, right? He still has to stop that marriage. And so should he have inappropriately slept with her and had a child, that child will not be a mamzer. In fact, we learned this, that Abaya said that, but we learned this in a Braita, in fact. Hakol modim, everybody agrees, meaning even Rabbi Akiva, beba'al hanida v'al sota, that if someone has relations with a nida or a woman who is his wife, who is a sota, and shomeret yavim, or a shomeret yavim. Now remember, shomeret yavim is a woman whose husband died, they have children, she has to do chalitza or yibam. If she goes out and sleeps with someone else, unrelated, meaning not one of the brothers, so although that's also a lotase, in havlad mamzer. A child is not a mamzer. Says the Gemara, why didn't Abaya say that? Abaya shomeret yavim misafkale. Abaya was unsure if this halacha also applied to a shomeret yavim. I kirav, I kishmo. Rashi says, we don't go through it here, but we're going to have it later actually in the Masechet, in around the month, that there is a machloket between Rav and Shmuel about how to understand the status of a shomeret yavim. There's one opinion that, I think it's Rav's opinion, that a shomeret yavim, even, of course, the Torah says she can't marry somebody, right? Lo tiyeh eshet hamet hachutza leish zar. It's very explicit pasuk. She cannot sleep with a foreign person, meaning not not her husband's brother. But according to Rav, that means that if she does marry someone, there's no kiddushin. If a stranger comes up to her and gives her kiddushin, it's not chal. But according to Shmuel, it is. And they darshan from psukim, right? Lo tiyeh, right? The tiyeh means that she could be havaya. So the machloket later on between Rav and Shmuel as to whether or not a person a non-brother who marries a yevama, or a woman who's omed for yibum, whether that kiddushin is chal. And so it would depend on whether the child becomes a mamzer. Because according to Abaya's formulation, if kiddushin is chal, then even though the relationship is prohibited and the Torah says don't do it, it doesn't produce a child who's a mamzer. But if kiddushin is not chal, then the child isn't.
But can she stay married to him?
She definitely can't stay married. The question is what happens to the kiddushin. Do you have to give a get? According to Shmuel, you have to give a get. So according to Shmuel, if another man went over to her and gave her kiddushin and she accepted it, he has to divorce her because there is a chalot to that kiddushin.
And then yibum would still apply? Then the brothers would still have to do yibum or chalitza?
The brothers would still have to do chalitza. I think we don't let them do yibum. Yeah, we'll discuss this later though.
And then I see. Oh, so she couldn't marry that person again.
Well, meaning
she had relations, then she did.
Sure. So you're saying it's a sugya later. It's like 40 daf, so it's been a while since I learned it. But I guess the question is, you're saying if the kiddushin is not chal, which is Rav's opinion, or even Shmuel, I guess it is chal, and you give a get, and then she does chalitza, could she go back and marry that person? It's a good question. It sounds to me like maybe the chalitza would probably make it a new relationship, which means you couldn't. But let's discuss it later. I don't recall if the Gemara discusses it. So it's a very appropriate Yevamot question. So good job. So let's see if we get to that later. Continue the Mishnah. Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Azai Tani. Now, in fact, we learned in a Braita, Shimon ben Azai Omer, and this is, there's an interesting debate about whether you call him Rabbi Shimon or Shimon ben Azai. But Shimon ben Azai said, Matzati Megillat Yuchsin b'Yushalayim, right? I found this old scroll which was, of course, a very rare thing for them to write things down. Probably was very expensive, but also wasn't a lot of skill and knowledge in writing. But I found this old scroll, the Katuvba Ish Ploni Mamzer Me'eshet Ish, which is what we quoted in our Mishnah. But interestingly, there were a few other pearls that were in this scroll. What did it say? Katuvba Mishnat Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov. The teachings of Reb Eliezer ben Yaakov, Kav V'Naki. Right? It's very famous terminology, right? They are Kav. So usually what this means, Kav V'Naki, means that they were a small amount. Kav, remember, is a very small measure, and they're rare and they're clean, meaning very few, you're going to find very few statements from Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, because he didn't, I guess, teach a lot of, absolute things to be shared. I'm sure he talked all day, but maybe he didn't talk all day, but the Mishnah is not just everything a person says. It's what they codify as their rules. Very few things come from Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov, but they're very clean, meaning we always paskin like you, okay? So rely on Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov when you see it. And furthermore, it said in this Megillat Starim, Katuv ba Menashe haragit Yishayo, that we have a tradition, which is not based on the pasuk, but we have a tradition that Menashe killed the Navi Yishayo. Menashe, the evil king of Yisrael, killed Yishayo and Navi, who I think was his great-grandfather or grandfather. I think it was his grandfather, right? It says that, so Menashe's father was Chizkiyo, who married a daughter of Yishayo, right? So anyway, but Menashe killed Yishayo, which of course is not terribly, it's very sad, of course, but it's not so surprising because Yishayo kept prophesying against idol worship, and Menashe was very, very good at idol worship. It was a strong suit of his. And so you could see why there was a lot of debate in that family. So unfortunately, that was a tradition that Menashe killed Yishayo. Now, Amar Rava, says Rava, in fact, it was a little bit more complicated. It wasn't like Menashe woke up one morning and killed Yishayo. Meidan Daine Vikata. He had a court case, right? And he judged his grandfather, the prophet Yishayo, and decided he was chayiv mita. What was his argument? Amar le, so Menashe said to Yishayo and Navi, Moshe Rabcha Amar, right? Your teacher Moshe is your rabbi, right? Says in the Torah, Ki lo yirani ha'adam v'chai. God says to Moshe, I will show you, through a mask, right? The whole psukim in Kitisa, because a person cannot see God and live. But if you recall, the beginning of Sefer Yeshayahu, or close to the beginning, At Amrit, you said, Areini at Hashem yeshev al kisei ram v'nisa. I saw God sitting on the throne. How could you claim to have seen God in Shemayim, on the throne, if Moshe says no one can see God? Okay, that's one problem. Furthermore, Moshe Rabcha Amar, Moshe, your teacher in the Torah, it says, Mi kashem Elokeinu, who is like Hashem our God, who's available, b'chol kareinu alav. Whenever you call out to God, God is available to listen, to respond, to hear the tefillot of Bnei Yisrael, right? That's what the Torah says. It says that in Bet Chanan, right? I'm sorry, in Akev, I guess. Maybe in Ray. It says in Devarim. But you said, very famous psukim in Yeshayahu, which we read in the Haftorah, Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo. You should seek out God when God is available to be found, implying that God's not always available, right? You should seek out Hashem when God is found. So that contradicts the Torah. Furthermore, this is the most devastating one, Moshe Rabcha Amar, it says in the Torah, Et mispar yamecha amaleh. The number of your days I will fill up, meaning, we think that means that God assigns a certain lifespan to each person, and that's how long they're going to live. That's fixed. But what you said, At Amrit, you said the very famous story that Menashe's father, Chizkiyo, became sick, right? The Torah, the Navi tells the story. He was sick, he was going to die, and Yeshayahu came to him and said to him the following words, Hosafti al yamecha chamesh esrei shana. I'm going to add 15 years to your lifespan. So God says to a person, God says in the Torah, a person's days are fixed, and you, Yeshayahu, are walking around adding years to people's lives. So you're a heretic, everything you've done goes against the Torah, and we're going to kill you. That was what Menashe said.
He forgot that these are like up to God to punish, not for humans,
So the Gemara is going to ask the answer. But Menashe was doing, now of course, Menashe was not exactly someone who followed the Torah that closely. So it's a little hypocritical. But
He's being hypocritical.
For sure. There's no question. But
come on.
So the Gemara is going to point that out. Amar, and again, this is obviously all a medrash, right? But Amar Yishayo. Now Yishayo said to himself, Yadana be d'lo made imale. I know that anything I say to him, he's not going to listen to, right? I mean, he's made up his mind. He's looking for an excuse to kill me because I'm a thorn in his side. Finding excuses for myself is not going to change the reality here. So I'm not going to say anything. The Amale, if I said my arguments to him, Ashvaya Mazid, he'll be doing it b'mazid. It'll be a worse thing. He'll be doing it somewhat willfully. Now he in his crooked thinking thinks that he's actually defending the Torah. He thinks that he's the real defender of God, and I'm the heretic, right? I know he's just looking for a way to kill me, and if I defend myself, he'll know that he's doing it b'mazid. So I'm not going to say anything. So I'm going to disappear. That was Yeshayahu's strategy. Amar Shem, he said the name of God or a name of God or some magic, and Ivla Ba'arza, he got hid inside a cedar tree. You know what this means. You could see that if you were like Kabbalah and Midrash, you can go very far with all this. But Yeshayahu, I guess there was a tree there, and he got absorbed into the tree, in the middle of the tree. So of course that didn't stop Menashe, and he basically cut it down, right? Atyula Arza v'Nasrua. So they came to Menashe, took the tree and started cutting it up, chopping it up to kill Yeshayahu, who was somewhere inside it. Kimata lahade puma, when they came to where his mouth was, to where Yeshayahu's mouth was inside this tree, I guess where he was standing, nach nafshe, then he died. And the reason he died, that was a punishment, because Mishum Shenemar, Yeshayahu was punished because when he described his inaugural nevuah, when he talks about, when God said to him, who are you? He said, I am betoch am tamei sfatayim ani anochi yoshev. I live among people who have, tamei mouths, tamei lips. And so he said something negative about Bnei Yisrael, and so he was punished in a way that was corresponded to his lips. But obviously it wasn't, the punishment was unfair, but that's why it happened in that way. So anyways, that's the story that's based on this remez in the Megillat Sitarim. Ask the Gemara today, but Mikol Makom, at the end of the day, Kashu Kraya Adadi, these verses do seem to contradict each other, right? I mean, Menashe had some good points there. Says the Gemara, well, we can explain each one. The first one was, can you see God? How does Yeshayahu see God if God cannot be seen, right? Ve'eret Hashem. Well, that's Kidditanya. The Braita says, Kol ha-neviim nistaklu v'espakloria she'enu me'ira. When all the Nevi'im saw God, they saw God through like a cloudy mirror, right? Like a frosted glass kind of thing, right? Meaning it was not a clear vision. They did see Hashem, but they saw Hashem in a way that was not clear. Moshe Rabbeinu nistakel b'espakloria me'ira. Moshe saw through a very clear aspaklaria, through a clear vision, and therefore by Moshe it says, Kilo Yerani ha'adam v'chai. You can't see me and live, because the vision of Moshe is a qualitatively different vision than the vision of every other Navi, including Yeshayahu. So that's why Yeshayahu saw God, but obviously it was a different seeing than what Moshe had seen, and what Moshe said, no one can see. Okay, that's that psukim. Then the next one was that the Torah says that Hashem is available whenever we call out to Hashem, right? B'chol kareinu elav. And then Yeshayahu says, Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo, that seek out God when God is found. So how do you explain that? There says the Gemara, the next one, Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo, depends on whether it's a yachid or a tzibur. We've quoted this before in Rosh Hashanah, right? Habi yachid, habi tzibur. If you're an individual, then God has limited times. If you're a tzibur, whenever a tzibur calls out to Hashem as a community, God listens. And so when the Torah says, B'chol kareinu alav, right, it's referring to the tzibur, to the public. But when Yeshayahu said, Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo, it's referring to an individual. Okay, that's a good answer. But just out of curiosity, when is God available? Right? It says, Dirshu Hashem b'himatzo. Call out to God or seek God when God is to be found. When is God to be found? B'yachid emat, Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rabba bar Avua, of course known to us, Elo asara yamim shemein Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippurim. These are during those 10 days of Asaret Yemei Tshuva, as we call them now, right? That is from Rosh Hashanah until the culmination of Yom Kippur. That is when God is to be found. And so that's when even an individual has a very strong ability to just pray and to seek God. Finally, the third one was that it says, Et mispar yamecha amalei. God says, I will fill up the days of a person. And then Yeshayahu claimed that he was adding years to the life of Chizkiyahu. So says, well, Tanahi. In fact, there's a machloket Tanaim about how to understand that pasuk. What does it mean at Mispar Yamecha Amalei? Tanya. As we learned in the Braita, it says at Mispar Yamecha Amalei. What's that referring to? Says the Braita, top of Daf Nun now. Elu Shnei Dorot. These are the years that a person's going to live. That's how long a generation is going to go. Meaning, God determines at the onset a person's going to live for X amount of time. Zacha, says the Tanakam, which is Rabbi Akiva, if a person does good things in this world and they're zocheh, mashlimim lo, they get their full time. Meaning, God sets a maximum time, basically, a desired, maybe, expected time. If a person is zocheh and they live a good life and they're fortunate and they don't get stuck up in a war or whatever, then they get mashlimim lo, then they get that time. Lo zacha, if they are not zocheh, then they get less, right? If they do averot, if they're in an unfortunate situation, then pochatin lo, then the person unfortunately can always die before their time. Divrei Rabbi Akiva. According to Rabbi Akiva, there's no adding. The Chachamim say, Omrim, Zacha, no. God gives a person a time. But if a person is Zacha, Mosifin lo, then they can get extra time if they're very meritorious. Lo Zacha, Pochatin lo, they get less time, right? So that is, meaning there's a set time. So the question, of course, is what's the point of the set time, right, if that's the case? The Tosas here quotes the Gemara we had in Moed Katan, which the very famous words of B'nei Chaye Umizone Lav B'schuta Talya Milta, right? That's Tosas in the top line here. That a person's children, meaning whether, I think it means whether they have children or which children, their life, their Chaye, their years, and their Mizone and their wealth are not related to their schut. So how could you say that you're given a certain amount of time, and if you do good, you get more, if you do bad, you get less? So Tosas here says the very fascinating and incredible explanation that there's like common zechuyot and there's exceptional zechuyot, right? Meaning there's the expected. And what you do day by day, so to speak, does not change that. But if someone does something exceptionally good or exceptionally bad, then it can certainly impact and change probably all those things. But from our Gemara's standpoint, it can change the life of a person. Okay? Tosas says, what are his words? Zchut gadol. Zchut gadol is what he calls it, right? A very exceptional zchut in either way. So
in general, ein mazal Yisrael, right? That's meaning like usually it doesn't, your zchuyot don't really matter, right?
Well, mazal, no, that's a little bit, again, we're mixing a few things here, but mazal meaning that things are fixed and that sort of they understood mazal to mean sort of using the power of the mazal, right? So using calling out a certain spirit on someone or time of the day is not going to affect it. It's sort of fixed. But obviously, as Tosas says here, I don't know if it's obvious because others might argue, Tosas says here, but none of that's limiting. It means that it's, in general, there's not that much, but exceptional zchuyot or exceptional avonot will change that. So that's how the Chachamim understand it. So that, of course, makes sense according to Yeshayahu, that if he said to Chizkiyahu that if you do tshuva here, that you can add years to your life. But says the Gemara, we keep going, Rabbi Akiva, the Chachamim said to Rabbi Akiva, how can you say that a person's days are never added? Harei hu omer, didn't Yeshayahu say to Chizkiyahu, Osafti al yamecha chamesh esrei shana, I'm going to add 15 years to your life. So how could that be? According to you, no one can ever add years. You can only lose years. Amar lo, so Rabbi Akiva said, no, this, you misunderstood what happened here. Amar lahem, mishelo osifulo. That what happened was it was Chizkiyahu's own years, meaning Chizkiyahu had X number of years. He had sinned and lost 15 years. And Chizkiyahu and Yeshayahu came to him and said, now that you've done Shuvah, you're going to get back the 15 years that you originally had. So it's not that you get extra years. You had your own years that you had previously lost, basically. So you can regain those. And that's what he was telling him. And in fact, Teda, it must be that the Chizkiyahu was supposed to live those years, meaning the additional years that he ended up living. Because, interestingly, Hare Navi Omeid Mitnabe, there was a Navi who stood up at the time of Yeravam ben Nevat, so 200 years earlier, maybe more, 250, whatever, it's not so clear. In the Navi, it's like 250 years earlier, right? Maybe 300 years even earlier, 250. So 200 years plus earlier, and he said, Hinei ben nolad lebeit David, there's going to be a child born in the house of David, Yoshio Ushmo, right? He'll be Yoshio. Remember, Yoshio was the great grandson of Chizkiyahu. He was Menashe's grandson, right? The last great king of Yehuda. Now, the thing is that this was Chizkiyahu's great grandson. But at the time that Chizkiyahu got sick, he didn't have any children yet, right? So if Chizkiyahu had died without children, how could his great grandson Yoshio be born, right? So it must be that Chizkiyahu was meant to have a son who ended up being Menashe, who had Yoshio, whose grandson was Yoshio. Chizkiyahu was punished that he lost those years, right? And now he was being restored to him. But it must be that the original plan was that Chizkiyahu was going to live long enough to have a son, which he ended up doing, of Menashe, who ended up having more children, who ended up having Yoshio, right? Because otherwise, how would you fulfill the prophecy? Adayin lo nolad Menashe. At the time that Chizkiyahu got sick and almost died, he didn't have any sons. He didn't have Menashe, or he might have had other sons, but he didn't have Menashe, who ended up being the grandfather of Yoshio. Rabbanan said, Rabbanan, that's not a proof at all. Because all the Torah, all the Navi said in the times of Yeravam was that there was going to be a child born Lebeit David, whose name was Yoshio, right? Nitiv mi Chizkiyahu, doesn't say a child born to Chizkiyahu. It happened to be that Yoshio was born from Chizkiyahu. But that's not the Nevuah. The Nevuah is Lebeit David Ktiv. Imi Chizkiyahu nolad, imi ina shachrini. Right? So the Nevuah, it could be that he was going to be a child, a king one day, a great king named Yoshio. It turned out that Yoshio was a great grandson of Chizkiyahu. But if Chizkiyahu had died without children, then Yoshio would have come from somebody else, right? Yoshio, so again, this is a very fascinating and deep concept, which is that there is a neshama or a spirit or a kid who's going to be Yoshio, who comes from one of the kings of David. It doesn't necessarily have to be from the way that it happened. It ended up happening that Chizkiyahu had Menashe, who had whatever his name was, I forgot his name. I think we'll start with an ayin. Anyways, the son of Menashe, he was no good guy. He was a king except for a year. He did everything like Menashe. He was bad, and then his son was Yoshio, right? So, and so basically, it's not a proof. But where we come out is that according to Rabbi Akiva, a person can never get more years, but if years are taken away from them from sin, they can get them back. But according to the Chachamim, the at Mispar Yamecha Amalei means sort of the default. That's the years God gives a person. A person who's Zocheh can add to that time. And that's what happened with Chizkiyahu. I'll just read the last few lines because why not? Even though we're way ahead of daf and a half. Ishto Shemeita, right? The end of the Mishnah was if a person's wife dies, he can marry the sister, etc., etc. Amar Rav Yosef, I think this is totally extra. Kan Shana Rebbe Mishnah She'enu Tzricha. This is Rebbe teaching us a Mishnah that is really unnecessary because we know all these rules. There's nothing that's really added by telling us these halachot, right? The basic principle that everybody knows that we've said before is that a person cannot marry their wife or ex-wife or Yevama or ex-Yevama or a chalitza sister during her lifetime. But once she's not alive, then he can marry that person. Period.
So what was the purpose of all these stories about adding lives and removing lives? What did it have to do with
exactly
with what we were talking about?
That's a good question. So I mean, I think on one hand, it's a counterpoint to this whole question of meaning. Well, so I think the deeper question you're asking is why are these things together in the Megillat Yuchsin, right?
What does it have to do with Mamzerut?
Right. So why? So that's the question. Why is there a scroll that has 3 details? Right. We quoted. A mamzer is this. Mishnat Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov Kavanaki, which seems to have nothing to do with anything, right? Obviously. And then this story about Menashe killing his grandfather Yeshayahu. So I mean, one answer, I don't know the answer, but I think one explanation you can give is that, of course, the Mamzerut is a very challenging thing, right? Because it's a decree on the kid that they're never going to become in the Gahal. They're Jewish. They're obviously very limited. We're going to discuss later what a Mamzer might be able to do to get back in, but it's not simple, right? And so maybe this is a good, hopeful ending that, even when one has been decreed to have a tough lot in life, let's say, right? Because the Mamzer doesn't choose to be a Mamzer, of course, that there is, through God, some salvation, some Yeshua through Zechuyot. That's a good connection. Let's say that. We will later, we discuss Mamzer in more detail later on, and discuss, what a Mamzer in fact can do. Who can they marry? And is there a way to ever get out of being a Mamzer? It's a very challenging topic.
What was so first there's Chizkiyahu, and then
Chizkiyahu well, the first is Yeshayahu, just to be clear. He was a Navi. Chizkiyahu married, I think, Yeshayahu's daughter. I'm pretty sure about that. Maybe it's his brother's daughter. Anyways,
Chizkiyahu's son was.
Chizkiyahu was a good king, as you know, but Chizkiyahu in his lifetime got very sick. He was going to die. He had this whole story where he prayed to God. God gave him more years. That's the prophecy. Chizkiyahu then had a child named Menashe, who was terrible. He was probably the longest, he was both the greatest in terms of years and probably power, and maybe the worst in terms of evil of all the Malchei Yehuda, right? That was Menashe. He was king for 55 years, and he spread idol worship throughout the land. Menashe died, and he had a son who became king for a year, but I don't remember his name, but he was bad.
Okay.
And then Menashe, that son died, and Yoshiyahu took over. Remember, Yoshiyahu was a kid. He was like 13, I think. He became the king, and Yoshiyahu ended up, as the pasuk says in the Navi, Lo shav Yisrael. No one ever returned to God in the days of from the days. I don't know the Navi. It's a beautiful pasuk. It says there was never anyone else like Yeshayahu, like Yoshiyahu, who returned to Hashem b'chol levavo u'b'chol nafsho. I forgot the exact language. Ki Moshe Rabbeinu or something that says. It's a beautiful language. Yoshiyahu returned to God and destroyed all the idols, and led to a whole rejuvenation of Bnei Yisrael. Unfortunately, it was a little bit too late because the die was already cast, and the Churban was on its way around 20 years later.
Okay. Who's the one who killed Yeshayahu?
Menashe killed his grandfather Yeshayahu, Navi. Yoshiyahu, his grandson, was a king. And remember, if you recall, we learned this recently. I forgot where we learned at the end of, Moikatan. Remember that Yoshiyahu was killed, as the pasuk says, by Paro Necho in the fields of Megiddo.
Right.
War, because he said the whole story of Cherev Lo Tavar Ba'artzachem, and that was the whole story of Yoshiyahu. But Yoshiyahu lived in the times of Yirmiyahu, which is a different prophet. So keep all your names together here. But Chizkiyahu was 3 generations earlier. He was like 70, 80 years earlier.
Right.
Chizkiyahu was a great king, and he led to tremendous growth, right? But unfortunately, his son Menashe did not sustain it.
Right. And Yeshayahu was in Chizkiyahu.
Was a generation before, and with Chizkiyahu.
Say that again.
Yeshayahu was a Navi, and Yirmiyahu were Naviim, right? They were all from the royal family. So Yeshayahu was a Navi who was in the generation of Chizkiyahu HaMelech. He was his father-in-law.
Right.
And he was killed by his grandson Menashe.
But Menashe was the grandson of Yeshayahu?
Yeah. He was the father-in-law of Chizkiyahu.
Because he was a what?
He was the father-in-law of Chizkiyahu.
Father-in-law.
He was the father of Menashe.
Okay. Father-in-law of Chizkiyahu. And he was married to Chizkiyahu's daughter? No.
Menashe was Chizkiyahu's son.
Yeah, no, but I'm trying to figure out the connection between Chizkiyahu and Yeshayahu, the prophet.
So there are 2 connections, I think. First of all, he was his uncle. And second of all, he was his father-in-law. But forget about the uncle for a second. Yeshayahu was the son of Amos, right? It says Yeshayahu ben Amos. Remember, there's Yeshayahu ben Ammon, right? Yeshayahu ben Ammon, sorry. There's a Gemara that says Ammon and Amatzia were brothers. Anyways, let's say this way. Yeshayahu was the grandfather of Menashe, and he killed him. Menashe killed his grandfather. Okay. But that's not important to our sugya. So the relationship of grandfather is not mentioned here, right? Our Gemara just says that Menashe killed Yeshayahu. That's what it says in the Megillat Starim.
Right. Okay.
And he killed him, according to Menashe, because he found that Yeshayahu was a false prophet because he kept contradicting Moshe Rabbeinu. Because he had all these examples where Yeshayahu said things that seemed to take liberty with the understanding of the Torah. Okay? Now, of course, Menashe himself had no problem taking liberty with the Torah, but nonetheless. Okay, everyone, have a great day. Shavua Tov.
Have a good day. Happy donuts.
Donuts. Okay, we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks.